Unions have been one of the most powerful tools any group of workers have in their arsenal if they want to ensure their rights are protected. The company needs the worker to produce the product that they sell. If those workers stop making that product, the company stops making money. There's a long history all over the world of unions successfully standing up to who's in charge and asking for their fair share. Sometimes, though, asking for more food can get your hand bitten. Workers banding together in a union is generally a good way for them to create a better work environment. This isn't to say they come without risk, of course, because if history has taught us anything, it's that those with power are rarely willing to give it up so easily, and on occasion, such an attitude has even led to outright violence breaking out as union busters or even the military gets involved. Such was the case in 1914 during the Ludlow massacre. Working in a mine was always going to be a risky way to earn a living, especially during the early 20th century when safety procedures weren't anywhere near the level they are today. Still, for many it was the only option they had available to them, and that was why it was one of the most heavily employed industries at the time. That was particularly true in Colorado, as there, a wealth of ore was just waiting to be brought up to the surface and used for a number of different purposes. The only problem was that while the Centennial State offered a lot of opportunities for employment because of that, it also had one of the worst track records when it came to accidents and injuries. According to state historian William Convery, more than 1,700 miners died in coal mine accidents between the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. Why such high numbers? Well, aside from the risks of cave-ins and general breathing in of toxic air, there were also a high amount of explosions caused by the mixing of coal dust and methane, an incredibly volatile gas which occurred naturally within the spaces. That fact made things particularly difficult, especially as the other conditions of the miners' job weren't exactly great either. Aside from regularly putting their lives on the line, they were also being asked to work 12-hour days, 6 to 7 days a week. As if that wasn't enough, they weren't even paid by the hour, but rather by the amount of coal they produced instead. So, given that every second down there counted when it came to eking out a living, time devoted to making sure things were safe was often seen as something that had to be sacrificed. As William Convery put it himself, quote, "The work to make your mining environment safer, to lay track, to clear escape routes, to timber up mines, to wet down the ground so dust didn't build up, that work was ironically known as dead work. It was work that made you safe, but for which you were not compensated." Of course, there was one ace up their sleeve the miners of Colorado had to play if they wanted to try and improve their conditions, and that was to band together as a collective and threaten to go on strike. After all, it wasn't as if their employers could afford to get rid of all of them, as this would bring production to a complete standstill. And that was exactly why, feeling like they had no other choice if they wanted to ensure they'd be able to go home at night and be with their families, they decided to join up with the United Mine Workers of America in September of 1913. From there, they used the support of the organization to call for a complete work stoppage. Obviously, that news didn't go down well with their employers, even if the list of demands was entirely reasonable. What were their demands? Well, aside from a 10% increase in wages and the right to be paid for time spent carrying out essential safety precautions, the Colorado miners also wanted both an 8-hour workday as standard and the ability to elect their own checkweight men, the person responsible for weighing the coal produced that day and determining how much the workers should be paid for it. That wasn't all they wanted either. No, on top of those things, they felt they deserved the right to trade in any store, live in any space, and seek care from any doctor in the area, something they weren't allowed to do under the current conditions. As well as that, they also believed it was only fair Colorado state mining laws be strictly enforced at all times and that armed mine guards no longer be present while they were working. That right, perhaps in an attempt to deter any potential thievery or dishonesty, the mine owners, Colorado Fuel and Iron, had long since taken to keep watch over their workers in the most dramatic way possible. Was it necessary? No, but it gave them an additional excuse to exert further control over their staff through means of fear. But fear is only an effective tool for so long, and eventually, no matter how much you try to scare someone, if their conditions are poor enough, then they're going to rebel, which is exactly what happened here. Unfortunately for the miners, though, they quickly found out that even with their collective bargaining power in play, they were still widely outmatched by the sheer strength of their employers. In an attempt to show who was really in charge early on, Colorado Fuel and Iron forced the striking workers out of their company-owned homes. So, with nowhere else to go, those same workers were instead forced to set up tent cities on the open prairie with the help of the United Mine Workers of America. Of these tent cities, one of the most notable was Ludlow, as it was the biggest of the bunch, housing people from all sorts of varying ethnic backgrounds. For as much as that led to a strong sense of community developing between the people living there, it didn't do much to help them through the particularly harsh winter of December of 1913. No, with only thin tents to protect themselves from the elements and limited supplies on hand, many families found themselves struggling as snow often piled up to the point it caused their makeshift homes to collapse in on themselves. As if that wasn't a big enough problem for them to deal with. During that period, the residents of Ludlow also regularly found themselves being targeted by raids from the National Guard, who used the pretty flimsy excuse of saying they were merely searching for hidden weapons caches. Obviously then, that was all just another way to try and push fear into the hearts of the workers and get them to give up on the strike more quickly. Sure, it was true they were armed for the most part, but they were well within their rights to do so, especially once it became apparent the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency had been hired to act as strikebreakers. But how was Colorado Coal and Iron able to exert such sway that they managed to involve such organizations in the first place? How was it they managed to get actual government involvement to back them up in their strike-busting attempts? Well, as it happened, they were primarily owned by probably the wealthiest man in the world at the time, John D. Rockefeller. That's right, even if many local ranchers were willing to help out the cause in any way they could, and even if notable labor rights activists such as Mary Harris were vocal in their support for the miners, it didn't really mean anything when compared to the real enemy they were up against. That was because, with his seemingly unlimited resources, Rockefeller had the ability to get pretty much anyone in a position of authority on his side with ease. Just take, for example, his speech at a congressional committee on April 6, 1914, where, in the midst of the strike, he argued, quote, "These men have not expressed any dissatisfaction with their conditions. The records show that the conditions have been admirable. A strike has been imposed upon the company from the outside." Of course, in most cases, such a statement would be met with a healthy dose of skepticism, but coming from the world's most powerful man, it was able to win over the committee, even when he chillingly talked about the possibility of his employees dying in order to bring things to an end. It went over well on that day. Sure, the committee likely thought such an eventuality would never actually occur, that no one would be crazy enough to allow for a massacre to take place under their watch. Unfortunately, it would, and the day everything finally kicked off would be April 20th, 1914. Sometime in the early morning, a militia group came into the Ludlow camp looking for a strikebreaker who was believed to be hiding somewhere within it. Now, it's not clear who fired the first shot, but what is clear is that pretty soon the situation escalated to the stage where bullets were being fired on both sides. On the militia's side, it initially involved shooting into the tent colony from the surrounding high ground, as they felt such a location provided them with the best point of leverage. Meanwhile, on the miners' side, they'd be forced to take cover behind an embankment near a railroad track and try their best to start a counterattack from there. As for those who weren't taking up arms directly, well, they'd do their best to get the hell out of Dodge, as the last thing they wanted was to get caught up in the crossfire. So that was why, as the shooting was picking up speed, many of the residents of Ludlow began to either find as good of a hiding place as they could, or evacuate the encampment entirely. In the words of one woman, Jodine Parlapiano, who was only 9 years old at the time of the incident, quote, "My mother and her younger brothers hid in a barn when this was going on. My youngest aunt had to be a baby, so she was probably in my mother's arms. And the others, they hid in a well and they hid until dark." As the assault carried on, it was a terrifying situation and one that by that point there was simply no stopping. Even when a Colorado and Southern train drove through the battlefield at midday and attempted to give some cover to the strikers who were retreating into the hills, it did little to cease the continual gunfire. All it did was intensify the militia's desire to get the job done as, let's not forget, it was what they were specifically being paid to do by John D. Rockefeller. So, as those who could made their escapes and those who couldn't started desperately digging makeshift cellars under their tents in an attempt to find safe space to hide within, additional support was called in from the Colorado National Guard. As they entered the fray, they began pushing into the camps and setting fire to the place. What they didn't realize at the time, though, is that they were setting fire to the tents that many miners and their families were still hiding underneath. That was what directly led to the deaths of 2 women and 11 children who were caught below in one of those spaces. As Mary Petrucci, the granddaughter of one of the survivors, later put it, quote, "Apparently, a mattress had fallen over the opening of the pit. My grandmother and another woman were the only 2 people who walked out of that pit alive." And those wouldn't be the only deaths that occurred that day either. By the time nightfall came, a further 1 child, 2 miners, a guardsman, and an innocent bystander would also lose their lives, with that causing one man, Frank Snyder, to start running across the battlefield screaming, quote, "They're shooting children," once he realized his own son had been shot. Even after the 20th drew to a close, the battle continued to wage throughout the surrounding southern Colorado area for days, during which time dozens more would also perish, including Louis Tikas, a prominent Greek leader of the strikers. But why was the fighting still going on as far as 10 days after that initial siege? Well, that was because after seeing how brutally they'd been hit despite offering no obvious signs of aggression prior to that, the miners who managed to escape to the hills gathered all the weapons they could and took to engaging in a guerrilla war against any Colorado coal and iron mine they could find. At that point, the fog of revenge saw them become hell-bent on bringing down the entire coal mining system of southern Colorado. That meant going after strikebreakers, mine managers, and camp managers wherever they could find them, all while also using dynamite to blow up any mines that were still active. Of course, it made things easier for them that they weren't carrying out such acts alone by now. No, after news of what had taken place in Ludlow began circulating around the area, many other miners took up arms too and began going on their own killing sprees. The United Mine Workers of America even directly approved of that when they issued an official call to arms instructing their members to gather together all the weapons they could for the purposes of defense against their oppressors. Even railroad workers would take sides when many of them refused to drive soldiers to Ludlow, and once a funeral service was held for the at the time 26 confirmed dead a few days following the initial massacre, the miners who attended immediately walked over to a nearby building where they gathered a bunch of guns which had been stacked there for them. Then they took to joining the battle themselves. Yes, as it was reported in the media at the time, the hills in every direction suddenly seemed to be alive with men. Some 82 soldiers being brought in from Denver actually refused to take part in the proceedings at that point. And sure, that had just as much to do with moral issues over shooting women and children as it did getting involved in gunfights all throughout the area, but it showed the miners appeared to have the upper hand all the same. Perhaps it could have been the moment where a true revelation in the labor force finally took place, an unrecreatable instant where real change was officially enacted. And it may very well have gone that way had the union leaders' planned truce with state officials gone as they wanted at that point. But alas, any hopes of such a thing happening were ruined when strikers throughout the plains, still intent on continuing their war, roundly rejected the idea of a parley and simply carried on with their attacks just as they had before. So the real question now was, what would it take to stop the assaults? Was there any way to end the violence before even more people died? Well, the answer to that latter question would unfortunately be no, because on April 29th in Forbes, Colorado, the bloodiest day of the entire affair took place when over 300 armed strikers ransacked the town, destroying everything they could find along the way, whether that be property or people. With that happening right as thousands were also demonstrating on the lawns of both the state capital of Denver and at the Rockefeller offices in New York City, intense pressure was put on President Woodrow Wilson to finally take some definitive action in bringing the whole situation to a close. Luckily then, that's just what he did, as on the following morning, the commander-in-chief sent federal troops into Colorado in order to re-establish peace. While the striking miners initially went along with it as they believed Wilson was sympathetic to their cause, in the end, such an assumption proved to be untrue. Why was that? Well, once things were settled and the strike came to a close, the miners found their initial list of demands were not going to be met after all. On top of that, despite 60 men, women, and children being killed on their side of the battle, not one militiaman or mine guard would be indicted as a result. Obviously then, that left a sour taste in not only the strikers' mouths, but also in the mouths of those who'd supported them. That said, the person who they blamed most for that wasn't the president. No, it was none other than John D. Rockefeller himself. But then, why wouldn't he take the brunt of the blame? He was the man who sent the militia in to carry out the massacre in the first place. And he was the man who could have stopped the whole thing at any point by simply giving his workers a fairer set of conditions. American writer Upton Sinclair even addressed the business mogul personally regarding that matter soon thereafter when he wrote him an open letter stating, quote, "I intend to indict you for murder before the people of this country. The charges will be pressed, and I think the verdict will be guilty." As for Rockefeller's own personal opinion on the way things went down, though, well, that would be far more weighted in his favor, of course. As he put it, quote, "There was no Ludlow massacre. The engagement started as a desperate fight for life by two small squads of militia against the entire tent colony. There were no women or children shot by the authorities of the state or representatives of the operators. While this loss of life is profoundly to be regretted, it is unjust in the extreme to lay it at the door of the defenders of law and property, who were in no slightest way responsible for it." Unfortunately for him, however, by that point public sentiment had turned so far in the direction of the strikers that few had time for such hollow excuses. Because of that, a full-scale nationwide reproach for the Rockefeller family began playing itself out. So, in order to try and calm things, the patriarch of the clan took to bringing in labor relations expert and future Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King to help him develop reform for both his mines and the towns his miners lived in. Did the plan work? Yes. Enough to where workers voted to accept the changes and return to their roles soon thereafter. And as if that wasn't a big enough victory, by that point, Congress and other federal agencies had also formally launched their own investigations into what happened at Ludlow in order to see if they could get to the bottom of things. Of course, what they found was that an extreme miscarriage of justice had indeed taken place during the massacre, and because of that, 22 National Guardsmen would finally be court-martialed for their roles in it. In the end, all but one of those men would be acquitted, and while the changes to working conditions that had been promised did eventually become the general way of doing things, it took a lot longer than expected for that to happen. While things such as the 8-hour workday and the idea of being paid for carrying out safety procedures did eventually become the norm, it took a whole generation for them to get fully implemented. Even if that's the case, and even if you could argue it meant the strike ultimately failed in the short term, if we look at things on a longer scale, it was all worth it in the end. Not only did all of those things eventually happen, but in the 1930s, the United Mine Workers of America also launched the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the most successful and dynamic labor organization the country had ever seen up until that point. And when they later merged with the American Federation of Labor in 1955, the combined might of both organizations was able to help workers in all industries gain unprecedented influence. Would such a thing have happened had it not been for the Ludlow massacre? Maybe, but it certainly helped to remind people when the time came why it was so important. With the power of unions now diminishing again in the modern day, it should continue to serve as a reminder that if workers don't stick together, then they'll never have a true seat at the table. And if they don't have that, they'll always be at risk of something like what occurred on April 20th, 1914 in a tent city in Colorado. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.